It was a Tuesday that started cooperative and then got ideas. At 9, I'd run my standard shuttle. Up to the plant rooms with Wolfe to watch him commune with orchids the way other men commune with stock tickers, down to the kitchen to scrounge a taste of Fritz's preliminary inspirations, and back to the office to confirm that the morning paper still had the same notions about the world as it had yesterday. After 11, when Wolfe came down and settled his 1/7 of a ton behind the big desk, I could have sworn the day would lie down and purr. But it didn't. It arched its back and hissed in the form of a woman with the kind of request that makes sensible men check their insurance policies. She rang at 11:20. I opened the door and she did her best to fill it, not with bulk, but with presence. She was maybe 45, with the composure of a bank president and the face of someone who'd learned early that charm was a tool, not an accident. A hat and gloves, even in June, and a black leather portfolio clutched like it contained state secrets. She gave me the name without being asked. Celia Voss. "Mr. Wolfe," she said when I led her to the office, "I need to use your window. My position as Wolfe's assistant requires me to take the front seat when sense slams the brakes." I swung a glance at Wolfe, who was planted behind his desk like Mount Rushmore would be if it had preferred leather upholstery. Fritz had just brought in beer. The bottle sweated in the June heat, and Wolfe did not. He opened his eyes, a sound in our neighborhood that makes rent go up, and regarded our visitor with the expression he usually reserves for people who interrupt his orchid schedule. "My window," Wolfe said, as if testing the phrase for hidden explosives. "Which window, madam, and for what purpose?" "This one." She turned toward the bank of windows facing 35th Street. "The large one. I need to be seen through it." I kept my mouth where it belonged, but my eyebrows went out for a constitutional. The large window has witnessed me escort clients, cops, and criminals through that office door, but it's never been treated as a theater. More importantly, Wolfe controls those blinds with the same iron grip he uses on everything else in his domain. Wolfe wiggled a finger at the red leather chair. "Sit, Miss Voss." She corrected him, "Miss," and sat, placing her portfolio on her lap like a cat that might scratch. "I need to be photographed through your window by someone who's been watching me, someone who's been watching this office." Now that got Wolfe's attention. His bulk shifted. Not much, but enough to register as seismic activity. "You have been under surveillance." "We both have." She opened the portfolio and withdrew a single 8x10 photograph, sliding it across the desk. "This was delivered to my office yesterday." I took the photograph and gave it the full Archie Goodwin examination. It was a shot of this very room, taken from across the street at an elevated angle. The focus was sharp enough to read headlines, and what it showed was Wolfe's desk on a recent afternoon, with a letter bearing his monogram clearly visible on the blotter. The blinds were half closed, the way they usually are when the day gets nosy, but the telephoto lens had cut right through the shadows. In the right side of the frame, partly visible, was me in my chair, caught in profile like a suspect in a lineup. "Professional work," I said, studying the grain and angles. Telephoto from a 2nd or 3rd-story window across the street. The shooter knew what he was doing. "And what he was looking for," Miss Voss added. That photograph came with a note. It said, "I can see you wherever you go. There is an offer coming. You will accept it." Wolfe took the photograph and examined it with the concentration he usually reserves for orchid catalogs. His face revealed nothing, but something in the room's atmosphere shifted toward winter. When someone takes pictures of his office without permission, Wolfe doesn't just get annoyed. He gets methodical. "Why was this sent to you?" he asked. "Because I was here. A week ago. I came for an appointment I never kept. Arrived while you were with your orchids. Sat in that chair for perhaps 5 minutes before Mr. Goodwin explained your schedule and sent me away." She glanced at me. Whoever sent this wanted me to understand that if they can photograph your office, they can photograph me anywhere. I remembered her now. A face under a hat, 2 minutes at the door, a business card left on the hall table. I'd given her the standard explanation about Wolfe's ironclad schedule and suggested she try again. She hadn't. "And the offer?" Wolfe inquired. "It came last night. Not to me, to my board of directors. A very generous anonymous donation to the Kincaid Cultural Foundation, conditional upon my immediate resignation as executive director." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the portfolio. The letter was carefully worded, mentioning assurances of discretion and including this photograph along with others. Shots of me outside my apartment, at restaurants, entering this building. Whoever it is has resources and patience. The Kincaid Cultural Foundation. I knew the name, one of those organizations that turns money into culture and culture into influence. Big donors, bigger egos, and the kind of politics that makes City Hall look like a church social. The condition was explicit? Wolfe asked. "Resign at Thursday's board meeting, or the photographs will be used to clarify the board's judgment about my fitness for the position." She opened the portfolio again and withdrew a sheet of letterhead. "I've spent 12 years building my reputation in this field, Mr. Wolfe. I won't be forced out by a coward with a camera." Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half closed again. "You propose to use my window as bait." "I propose to force this person into the open. If I'm seen here this afternoon, and if another photograph arrives tonight showing as much, then we'll know our watcher is positioned across the street with a clear view of this room. Once we establish that, we can act." "We." The word sat on Wolfe's tongue like something that had applied for membership but hadn't been approved. "I'm prepared to pay your standard fee, plus expenses." She reached into the portfolio once more and produced a check. "I'm also prepared to provide you with a complete list of my board members, my schedule for the past 2 weeks, and the names of anyone who might benefit from my removal." Wolfe glanced at the check without touching it. He doesn't handle money directly. It's one of his peculiarities, like refusing to leave the brownstone or eating meals that don't qualify as events. But I could see the amount from where I sat, and it was sufficient to keep Fritz in truffles for a month. "Miss Voss," he said finally, "I do not rent my window. I do not operate a showcase for other people's dramas. You may find such services elsewhere." "I know what you are and what you are not," she replied. "I wouldn't have come if I'd meant mere display, but someone has violated your privacy as well as mine. Someone has photographed your office, your desk, your correspondence. They've made your business their business." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to hunt or chase, Mr. Wolfe. I'm asking you to let me sit in that chair for 10 minutes while your blinds are open. If that draws another photograph, we'll both know where our enemy is positioned." The office fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Wolfe sat motionless, but I could see his mind working behind those half-closed eyes. The violation of his sanctuary wasn't something he'd ignore, and the challenge implicit in Miss Voss's request, the suggestion that someone had made him a target in his own office, was exactly the kind of provocation that could move him from irritation to action. "Very well," he said at last. "But not as you propose. I will not rent my window, Miss Voss, but I will arrange a demonstration for my own purposes. You will be present when required. My fee is $5,000. If that presents difficulties, you may leave the photograph and contribute the money to your foundation's emergency fund." She didn't blink. "I brought a check for $10,000. I expected you to double me." I took the check, noted the bank and signature, and filed it in my desk drawer. Wolfe nodded once, a gesture that in his vocabulary means the business portion of the conversation has ended and the interesting part can begin. "Now then," he said, "who benefits from your departure from the Kincaid Foundation?" "That," Miss Voss said, "will take some time to explain." "We have time," Wolfe replied. "But first, we'll establish whether our photographer is still watching. Mr. Goodwin at 4:30. This afternoon, you will raise the blinds completely. Miss Voss will sit in that chair for exactly 10 minutes. I will arrange certain items on my desk to provide clear targets for any lens trained on this window. And if we get another photograph? I asked. Then we'll know our enemy's position, he said, and we can begin to learn his identity. He looked at Miss Voss. In the meantime, you will provide me with that list of board members, your recent schedule, and your thoughts on who might profit from your professional demise. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. I'll have everything to you within the hour. After she left, I went to the window and peered through the blinds at the buildings across 35th Street. Somewhere over there, someone with a camera and a plan had been watching us, photographing us, turning Wolfe's sanctuary into a fishbowl. It was the kind of violation that Wolfe wouldn't forgive or forget. So we're taking the case, I said. We are eliminating a nuisance, Wolfe corrected. Someone has presumed to make my office their observation post. That presumption will be corrected. He reached for his beer, and I knew that somewhere across the street, a camera might be recording even that simple gesture. The thought made my skin crawl, but it also made me smile. Whoever was behind that lens had just made the mistake of challenging Nero Wolfe in his own domain. The shot from across the street had been fired. Now it was our turn to shoot back. There are mornings when the brownstone feels like a fortress, and there are afternoons when it feels like a fishbowl. By 2 o'clock Tuesday, we'd crossed that line and kept going. The sanctuary that Wolfe guards with the dedication of a medieval monk had acquired visitors, watchers, and the kind of attention that makes a man check his locks twice. Miss Voss returned at 1:45 with a manila envelope thick enough to choke a filing cabinet and the look of someone who'd spent her lunch hour cataloging enemies instead of eating. I showed her back to the office, where Wolfe had positioned himself behind his desk with a fresh bottle of beer and the expression he reserves for complicated problems that might prove interesting. The Kincaid Cultural Foundation, she began, settling into the red leather chair, has an endowment of $42 million and a board of directors who treat philanthropy like a blood sport. She opened the envelope and withdrew a typed organizational chart. 7 members, including myself. I've ranked them according to their probable interest in my professional demise. I took the list and spread it across my desk. Dr. Marcus Whitfield heads your parade of well-wishers. Marcus is a professor of art history at Columbia with ambitions that outweigh his achievements. He's been positioning himself as my successor since the day I was hired, and he's made it clear he considers my MBA inferior to his PhD when it comes to cultural leadership. Her smile could have etched glass. He also controls Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's vote. She's 83, wealthy, and hasn't made an independent decision since her husband died. Wolfe turned a page in his notebook. That provides Dr. Whitfield with how many votes? 3. Eleanor inherited 2 donor seats when her husband passed, plus her own. She votes however Marcus advises, which gives him effective control of nearly half the board. Convenient, I observed. What about the others? James Hartley represents the Kincaid family's legal interests. He's competent and professional, but a change in leadership might mean new contracts and expanded legal oversight for his firm. Dr. Sarah Chen is a curator at the Whitney with her own foundation ambitions. My removal could create opportunities for her to reshape our mission or poach our donors. Vincent Romano owns galleries in Chelsea and has been persistent in his personal interest in me. When I declined his advances, he began questioning my judgment in board meetings. I made notes while she talked. Foundation politics, in my experience, make City Hall look like a church social. And the 7th member? Janet Morrison. She inherited a fortune and decided to give most of it away. Janet's been one of my strongest allies. If she wanted me gone, she'd tell me directly and probably offer to help me find a better job. The phone rang in the hall. I went to answer it, but the caller hung up before I could reach it. When I returned, Miss Voss was explaining the timeline to Wolfe. The anonymous donation offer arrived Monday night. This morning, Dr. Whitfield called an emergency board meeting for Thursday. The agenda includes discussion of administrative concerns and consideration of new board appointments. She handed Wolfe another document. Someone's moving very fast. Too fast, Wolfe agreed. Speed suggests either panic or confidence. We shall determine which. At 2:20, the bell rang again. I went to the door and found a young man in work clothes carrying a toolbox and a clipboard. He had Lou stitched on his shirt and the kind of smile that's been practiced in front of mirrors. "Service call," he announced. "Radiators need bleeding." "Radiators take the summer off around here," I told him. "They don't work overtime." He consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. Consolidated thermal, preventive maintenance for the whole block. That's an admirable ambition. Start with your manners. I shut the door on him and his toolbox. If he was legitimate, he had a phone number to call. If he wasn't, he had a supervisor somewhere who'd be disappointed in his reconnaissance. Back in the office, I reported the visit. Wolfe's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over a picnic. "No one else will answer the bell," he said, "and you will not open the door more than necessary. Our photographer has acquired assistance." At 3:15, we got an actual delivery. Flowers for Miss Voss, which she hadn't ordered. Long white lilies with a ribbon proclaiming "with our appreciation," and no card. Fritz took them to the kitchen sink, where they looked as out of place as a tuxedo at a baseball game. Wolfe refused to let them within 10 feet of the office. "The lilies are a message," he observed. "Someone wishes us to understand that our movements are anticipated." As 4:30 approached, I began the preparations Wolfe had specified. I placed his leather-bound copy of the Flora of the Congo prominently on the desk blotter, angled so the gold lettering would catch the light. His pewter paperweight, a bull mastiff with a cocked ear, went 2 inches to the right, nose pointing toward the calendar. The Ming Dynasty snuff bottle sat near his left elbow, small but unmistakable. "Parallax," Wolfe explained, noting my questioning look. "The relative positioning of objects will reveal our photographer's exact location and elevation." At 4:25, Miss Voss returned and took her position in the red leather chair. I raised the blinds completely, flooding the office with late afternoon sunlight. 35th Street spread before us like a stage, complete with passing pedestrians who had no idea they were part of someone else's drama. For 10 minutes, we held our tableau. Wolfe sat motionless behind his desk, eyes half closed but missing nothing. Miss Voss kept her gaze on the Persian rug, her hands folded in her lap. I stood by the window, trying to look bored, which, as Wolfe had noted, is one of my most useful skills. From the second-floor window of the building across the street, third from the east, I caught a glimpse of something that might have been sunlight on metal, or it might have been a lens, focused and clicking. At exactly 4:40, I lowered the blinds and we resumed breathing normally. "Now we wait," Wolfe said. We didn't wait long. At 5:30, the bell rang. A teenage messenger stood on the stoop with an envelope addressed to Miss Voss in block letters. "Who gave you this?" I asked. "Some guy," he said, which covered about half the population of Manhattan. $20 to deliver it personal. Inside the envelope were 2 photographs. The first showed our afternoon performance in perfect detail. Wolfe at his desk, Miss Voss in the chair, me at the window. The second was a close-up of Wolfe's desk arrangement, sharp enough to read the title on the book spine. Wolfe examined both prints with the concentration he usually reserves for orchid catalogs. "Second floor," he announced. "Third window from the east. The angle of foreshortening on the paperweight confirms the elevation." Miss Voss stood, gathering her things. "So we know where he is?" "We know where he was," Wolfe corrected. "Tomorrow, Mr. Goodwin will identify the occupant of that window. Tonight, you will leave by the front door and allow our photographer the satisfaction of documenting your departure." After she left, I found Wolfe examining the photographs again. Not like a man with a grudge, but like a scholar translating ancient text. "The brownstone has been disturbed," he said finally. "Good. Now it will justify itself." Outside, the city continued its evening routine, unaware that somewhere in those windows across the street, someone was watching, planning, and making the mistake of treating Nero Wolfe's sanctuary as their personal observation post. It was the kind of error that tends to be educational for everyone involved. The shot from across the street had been fired. Tomorrow, we'd start shooting back. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes private detectives optimistic and guilty parties reach for their alibis. I was at my desk by 8:30, fortified with Fritz's coffee and armed with a list of Kincaid Foundation board members that read like a catalogue of motives waiting to be explored. Wolfe wouldn't descend from his orchid communion until 11, which gave me 2.5 hours to do what I do best. Ask questions that make people uncomfortable and remember the answers they wish they hadn't given. The building across 35th Street yielded its secrets with the cooperation of a $20 bill and a building super who'd learned that curiosity pays better than discretion. The second floor housed Metro Nest, the shared office suite I'd visited the day before, but this morning I was armed with more specific questions and a keener eye for details. The woman with the administrative competence was there again, and she remembered me. More importantly, she remembered Caleb Vale and his prepaid everything approach to rental agreements. "He came back last night," she said, after another 20 had changed hands. "Around 7. Stayed maybe 20 minutes, packed up his equipment, and left. Said he got what he needed for his skyline blog." I examined the third room from the east more carefully this time. The faint half-moons in the paint where tripod legs had rested were deeper than I'd first noticed, suggesting repeated use over several days. In the corner, I found something more interesting. A small piece of electrical tape stuck to the window frame, positioned exactly where someone might mark the optimal angle for a telephoto lens. "Professional work," I murmured, peeling off the tape. Now, Mr. Vale wasn't just methodical, he was experienced. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe had descended and was examining Miss Voss's board member profiles with the concentration he usually reserves for orchid catalogues. She sat in the red leather chair, looking as composed as ever, but with shadows under her eyes that suggested her night had been less peaceful than Wolfe's. "Mr. Goodwin has confirmed our photographer's methodology," Wolfe announced without looking up. "Now we must identify his employer. Miss Voss, your board members present an interesting array of motives. We shall examine them systematically." He set down the files and regarded our client with half-closed eyes. "Tell me about the Renaissance bronzes." Miss Voss blinked. "I mentioned them yesterday, but only briefly." "How did you—" "You mentioned a major acquisition under consideration. Your tone suggested personal investment beyond mere professional duty." "Elaborate." "The Marchetti collection," she said, leaning forward slightly. 15 Renaissance bronzes, including 3 attributed to Cellini. They're being offered privately by a collector in Switzerland. The asking price is $12 million. "A significant expenditure," I observed. "A once-in-a-generation opportunity," she corrected. "These pieces would elevate the Foundation's international standing immeasurably. But the board is divided." Wolfe's eyebrows twitched, his version of sitting up and taking notice. "Divided how?" "Dr. Whitfield calls them overvalued relics that serve no educational purpose." Dr. Chen agrees, preferring we invest in contemporary digital installations. Mr. Romano has his own artists he'd rather see patronized. Mr. Hartley is concerned about the financial risk and potential provenance issues. And if you were removed from your position, the acquisition would die. Without my advocacy, the board would never approve such an expenditure. Her hands tightened in her lap. 12 years of building relationships, establishing credibility, positioning the Foundation for this moment, all wasted. Wolfe nodded slowly. so your removal serves multiple purposes. Personal ambition, philosophical differences, and financial considerations all converge. Most efficient. He gave me my marching orders with the economy of a general deploying troops. Dr. Whitfield first, ascertain his whereabouts yesterday afternoon and his knowledge of photography. Then Dr. Chen, Mr. Romano, and Mr. Hartley. I want to know not just where they were, but who they spoke with and what unusual activities they may have engaged in. Dr. Marcus Whitfield received me in his Columbia office, which looked like a museum curator's fever dream. Books in 7 languages, artifacts that belonged in display cases, and enough diplomas to wallpaper a small apartment. The man himself was tall, thin, and possessed of the kind of academic arrogance that makes cocktail party conversations insufferable. "Miss Voss," he said, settling behind his desk with the air of a man granting audience, "is competent within her limitations, but the Kincaid Foundation requires leadership with genuine cultural vision, not merely administrative efficiency." I let him explain his vision for 20 minutes, which involved more Latin phrases than a papal encyclical and less practical sense than a philosophy textbook. What emerged was a picture of a man who'd spent his career watching other people get the recognition he deserved. "The anonymous donation," I mentioned casually, "seems generous." His composure slipped for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for me to see surprise, calculation, and something that might have been guilt. Anonymous donations are common in our field. Wealthy patrons often prefer discretion. This one prefers Miss Voss's resignation. If that's the donor's preference, the board must consider it seriously. We have fiduciary responsibilities. He stood, indicating the interview was over. Miss Voss is welcome to seek employment elsewhere. Vincent Romano's gallery in Chelsea occupied 3 floors of converted warehouse space, all white walls and dramatic lighting. Romano himself was handsome in the way that makes women suspicious and men envious. Silver hair, expensive suit, and the kind of smile that comes with a warranty. "Celia's a remarkable woman," he said, offering me espresso from a machine that probably cost more than my car. Intelligent, dedicated, passionate about her work. I've admired her for years. Admired her enough to want her removed from the foundation? His smile never wavered, but something behind his eyes shifted into a lower gear. I want what's best for Celia. The foundation has become challenging for her. She might be happier in a less demanding position. Like what? I've offered her a position here. Gallery management, exhibition planning, client relations. She'd be working with art instead of bureaucracy. He sipped his espresso with practiced casualness. She's refused so far, but perhaps recent events will clarify her thinking. The way he said her name, too familiar, too possessive, catalogued him as a man discussing property he intended to acquire. Dr. Sarah Chen met me at the Whitney, surrounded by exhibition catalogues and the controlled chaos of multiple projects. She was younger than the others, maybe 35, with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned early that success required constant vigilance. The Kincaid Foundation's mission has expanded beyond its original parameters, she said without preamble. Celia's done excellent work, but the board needs leadership that understands contemporary cultural dynamics. And you understand those dynamics? I understand that cultural institutions must evolve or become irrelevant. Celia's background is business administration. She approaches culture like a balance sheet. Chen leaned forward, her hands folded precisely on the desk. The foundation needs someone who understands art as more than an asset class. When I mentioned the anonymous donation, she was ready for it. Board members aren't consulted about potential donations until they're formally presented. That's standard procedure. But you knew this one was coming. I knew the board was dissatisfied with certain administrative decisions. Change was inevitable. James Hartley at Kincaid & Hartley looked like a man who'd heard every story and billed for the good ones. His office smelled like leather, paper, and expensive caution. When I introduced myself, he offered the professional smile that shows teeth without committing them. "Anonymous gifts are a centuries-old tradition," he said when I got to the point. "As for conditions, boards often accept them when they align with governance interests. And when they include surveillance of your executive director?" That twitched his eyelid. He kept the smile, but set it down on the desk between us. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it. If you have evidence of a crime, present it to the police." "Don't worry," I told him. "If we need the police, they'll get their turn." By 4 o'clock, I'd collected 4 versions of innocence in one room with tripod scars. I returned to the brownstone, where innocence doesn't get the benefit of the doubt without an escort. Wolfe listened to my report with his eyes closed, sorting the information into piles only he could see. "Whitfield is eager, Romano is oleaginous, Chen is calculating, Hartley is wary," he summarized. "All have motive, all have opportunity. None has confessed." So where does that leave us? With the certainty that our photographer was hired by someone with intimate knowledge of Foundation politics and access to board information. He opened his eyes and reached for his beer. "Tonight, Mr. Goodwin, you will position yourself where you can observe the Metro Nest building. If our Mr. Vale returns for his equipment or his final surveillance, you will follow him, but you will not approach or confront. Just observe. Precisely. We will watch a watcher. That always yields more than a quarrel." As evening settled over 35th Street, I took my position at the front window, adjusting the blinds so I could see without being seen. The circle of suspects was complete, each with clear motives and opportunity. Somewhere among them was our anonymous donor, and somewhere across the street was the photographer who'd made the mistake of turning Nero Wolfe's sanctuary into a target. The brownstone had been disturbed, its peace shattered, its master's privacy violated. Now it was time to see which of our suspects would make the next move, and whether they understood the magnitude of their error in judgment. There are nights when surveillance work feels like a noble calling, and there are nights when it feels like watching grass grow in the dark while the grass gets paid better than you do. Wednesday evening fell into the second category. I was positioned across from the Metro Nest building by 8 o'clock, armed with coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing Wolfe would ask for details I hadn't bothered to notice. The third window from the east remained dark until 9:15, when a brief glow suggested someone had returned to collect the last of their equipment. By 9:30, the light was gone, and by 10 o'clock, I was reasonably certain our photographer had concluded his local business. Still, I waited until 11 before abandoning my post. Wolfe doesn't approve of assumptions, even the reasonable ones. Thursday morning brought the kind of crisp clarity that makes private detectives optimistic and guilty parties nervous. I was at my desk by 8:30, fortified with Fritz's coffee and ready to do what I do best, ask questions that make people squirm and remember the answers they wish they hadn't given. My first stop was the Kincaid Foundation offices, where Miss Voss's assistant Nadine proved to be a treasure trove of institutional memory and administrative detail. She had the kind of organized mind that catalogues irregularities the way librarians catalog books, systematically and with disapproval for anything out of place. "Dr. Whitfield has been unusually active this week," she said, consulting her appointment log with the precision of a Swiss timekeeper. "He requested access to the small conference room Monday afternoon and brought a guest, a young man with photography equipment who claimed to be researching visual documentation techniques for academic presentations." That raised an eyebrow. Photography equipment in a conference room? They closed the blinds, which struck me as odd for an academic discussion. After they left, the room smelled faintly of hot electronics. She made a note in her calendar. Dr. Whitfield also requested copies of all board correspondence from the past 6 months, including donor communications and meeting minutes. Standard board member privilege? Standard, yes. But he's never requested such comprehensive documentation before. Usually he's content with the summary reports. She glanced toward Miss Voss's closed office door. He also asked specifically about Miss Voss's schedule and any outside meetings she might have planned. I filed that information under interesting coincidences that aren't coincidences and moved on to my next appointment. Vincent Romano's gallery occupied 3 floors of converted warehouse space in Chelsea, all white walls and dramatic lighting designed to make visitors feel either sophisticated or inadequate. Romano himself was there, holding court with a young artist whose work looked like someone had explained abstract expressionism to a computer and then asked it to try harder. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, offering his practiced smile and a handshake that lingered just long enough to suggest intimacy without crossing professional lines. "How can I help you today?" "I'm following up on foundation business," I said, accepting his offer of espresso from a machine that probably cost more than most people's cars. Specifically, the board's position on major acquisitions. His smile remained steady, but something behind his eyes shifted into a more calculating gear. "The Marchetti bronzes, you mean? A significant investment for uncertain returns." "Uncertain how?" "Provenance questions, for one thing. Renaissance bronzes have complex histories, and the art market has become increasingly sensitive to ownership issues." He sipped his espresso with the casual precision of a man who'd practiced the gesture. "Then there's the question of educational value versus prestige acquisition." "And personally?" "Personally, I believe the foundation would be better served investing in contemporary works that speak to current cultural conversations." He gestured toward the artist's canvases. "Art should challenge and engage, not simply decorate prestigious walls." What he didn't mention, but what I'd learned from 20 minutes with his assistant, was that Romano had been quietly pursuing his own major acquisition, a collection of German expressionist works that would significantly elevate his gallery's international profile. His opposition to the Marchetti bronzes wasn't entirely philosophical. It was also practical. Foundation resources devoted to Renaissance bronzes meant less attention and fewer potential clients for his contemporary focus. My next stop was Columbia University, where Dr. Marcus Whitfield received me in his office with the air of a man granting audience to a particularly slow undergraduate. The office was a museum of academic achievement. Diplomas, awards, and photographs of Whitfield with various cultural luminaries, all carefully arranged to suggest importance without appearing desperate. "The Kincaid Foundation," he said, settling behind his desk with professorial authority, "requires leadership that understands the difference between cultural significance and mere commercial value. And Miss Voss doesn't understand that difference. Miss Voss understands balance sheets and donor relations. Those are valuable skills, but they're insufficient for guiding an institution with genuine cultural aspirations." He leaned back in his chair, warming to his theme. The Marchetti acquisition, for example, represents exactly the kind of thinking that prioritizes prestige over purpose. How so? $12 million for 15 bronzes that will sit in climate-controlled cases, visited by perhaps a few hundred serious scholars annually. That same money could fund educational programs, digital initiatives, and community outreach that would touch thousands of lives. His voice carried the conviction of someone who'd rehearsed the argument, but Miss Voss sees only the headlines and the donor photographs. What he didn't mention was his own complicated history with major acquisitions. A little research in the university library had revealed his involvement, 15 years earlier, in a controversial purchase for a regional museum, a purchase that had ultimately been quietly reversed due to provenance questions and had led to his departure from that institution under circumstances the official records described as mutual agreement to pursue new opportunities. Dr. Sarah Chen met me at the Whitney, surrounded by exhibition catalogs and the controlled chaos of multiple projects in various stages of completion. She was younger than the other board members, maybe 35, with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned early that success required constant vigilance and strategic thinking, The Foundation's mission has expanded beyond its original parameters, she said without preamble, her hands folded precisely on her desk. Celia's done excellent administrative work, but the board needs leadership that understands contemporary cultural dynamics, such as digital engagement, community partnerships, educational innovation. The art world has changed dramatically in the past decade, but the Foundation's approach remains rooted in 20th century thinking. She leaned forward slightly. The Marchetti acquisition exemplifies the problem: significant resources devoted to historical artifacts with limited contemporary relevance. You'd prefer contemporary acquisitions? I'd prefer strategic thinking that considers long-term cultural impact rather than short-term prestige. Her smile was professional, but cool. The Foundation could be a leader in digital cultural initiatives, but that requires leadership with vision beyond traditional collecting. When I mentioned the anonymous donation, she was ready for it. Board members aren't typically consulted about potential donations until they're formally presented. That's standard procedure for preliminary inquiries. But you knew this one was coming? I knew the board had concerns about administrative direction. Change was anticipated. James Hartley at Kincaid and Hartley looked like a man who'd heard every story, billed for the good ones, and learned to keep his expressions neutral regardless of the client's confession. His office smelled like leather, paper, and expensive caution. Anonymous donations are a centuries-old tradition in philanthropy, he said when I explained my visit. Donors often prefer discretion for tax purposes, family considerations, or simple personal preference. And when those donations come with specific personnel conditions? Conditional gifts are also traditional. Donors frequently express preferences about institutional direction, leadership, or programmatic focus. He straightened a stack of legal documents with unnecessary precision. The board's responsibility is to evaluate whether such conditions align with the Foundation's best interests, even when those conditions are accompanied by surveillance photographs. That got his attention. His professional composure remained intact, but something behind his eyes shifted toward higher alert. If you have evidence of illegal activity, Mr. Goodwin, I'd suggest you present it to the appropriate authorities. What if the illegal activity involves your office? Then I'd suggest you be very certain of your facts before making accusations. He stood, indicating the interview was over. The Foundation's legal affairs are handled with complete propriety. By 4 o'clock, I'd collected 4 versions of innocence. 2 clear, conflicts of interest, 1 suspicious history, and a growing certainty that someone was orchestrating events with considerably more sophistication than any individual board member had demonstrated. I returned to the brownstone, where Wolfe was examining Miss Voss's files with the concentration he usually reserves for orchid catalogs. Whitfield brought a photographer to the Foundation offices, I reported. Romano has his own acquisition agenda that conflicts with the Bronzes. Chen is positioning herself as the modernizing alternative to Miss Voss, and Hartley got nervous when I mentioned surveillance. Wolfe set down his beer and regarded me with half-closed eyes. 4 suspects with clear motives, but none with the demonstrated capability for the coordination we've observed. The surveillance operation required patience, resources, and professional execution. So we're looking for someone who hired the capability, or someone who possesses it. He reached for the telephone. Get Saul Panzer on the line. I believe we need a more thorough examination of our photographer's recent activities and his connection to the Foundation's legal affairs. As evening settled over 35th Street, I realized we'd moved beyond simple Foundation politics into something more complex and more dangerous. The anonymous donor wasn't just offering money for Miss Voss's resignation. They were orchestrating a campaign that involved surveillance, intimidation, and carefully timed pressure designed to force a specific outcome. The shot from across the street had been fired, but the shooter was still out there, still planning and still several moves ahead of where we thought we were. Tomorrow, Saul Panzer would help us close that gap. Tonight, I had the uneasy feeling that we were being watched, catalogued, and prepared for whatever came next in a game whose rules we were still learning. The brownstone felt less like a fortress and more like a target, but at least now we knew we were in a war. There are mornings when a man wakes up knowing his castle walls have been breached, and there are mornings when he discovers the breach over breakfast and realizes the enemy has been polite enough to wipe their feet. Thursday morning fell into the second category, which made it considerably more insulting than a straightforward burglary would have been. I came down to the kitchen at 7:30 to find Fritz examining his spice rack with the expression he usually reserves for ingredients that have personally offended the laws of gastronomy. The man organizes his culinary arsenal with the precision of a Swiss bank vault and the memory of an elephant with a filing system, so when he turned to me with wounded dignity radiating from every pore, I knew we had a situation. "The paprika," he announced, holding up a small glass container as if it contained evidence of war crimes, "has been violated." In Fritz's vocabulary, violated covers territory that ranges from improper seasoning to crimes against humanity. I accepted the coffee he handed me and prepared for a detailed briefing on the nature of the offense. "Someone has sampled it," he continued, his voice carrying the outrage of a man whose professional sanctuary had been desecrated. Approximately 1 teaspoon, removed with precision but without permission. The container was returned to its proper position, but the seal was broken and the contents disturbed. I examined the paprika container with the attention it deserved. Fritz's assessment was accurate. Someone had opened it, removed a small amount, and carefully replaced it in its designated spot on the spice rack. The violation was subtle, professional, and designed to be discovered by someone with Fritz's eye for detail. "When did you last use it?" I asked. "Tuesday evening for the veal." Every container returned to its exact position, every seal intact. Fritz's expression suggested that such precision was not merely professional habit, but moral imperative. This morning, I detected the disturbance immediately. Any other irregularities? None in the kitchen, but if someone has trespassed here, they have trespassed everywhere. He gestured toward the dining room with the gravity of a general indicating enemy territory. The sanctity of the house has been compromised. I took this intelligence upstairs to Wolfe, who was examining his morning mail with the methodical attention he devoted to anything that might disrupt his carefully orchestrated universe. When I explained about the paprika, his bulk shifted in the chair, not dramatically, but enough to register as seismic activity on the Wolfe scale of reactions. "Someone has been in the house," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Sometime between Tuesday evening and this morning. Fritz is certain about the timing, and his memory for kitchen details is infallible." I settled into my desk chair and reached for my notebook. The question is what they were really looking for. Wolfe's eyes narrowed to half-mast, the way they do when he's processing information that threatens to rearrange his understanding of events. A teaspoon of paprika suggests analysis rather than theft. Someone wanted to examine our food preparation methods, or perhaps introduce something into our supply chain. The thought sent an unpleasant chill through the morning air. Poison, or surveillance devices. Modern electronics can be remarkably miniaturized. He opened the right-hand drawer of his desk, felt along the interior surface, and withdrew his hand with an expression of grim satisfaction. They were also interested in my security precautions. What security precautions? I placed a single hair across the drawer opening yesterday evening, a strand from my own head, positioned where it would break if the drawer were opened. He showed me his empty fingers. The hair is gone, and with it, a small envelope containing the piece of electrical tape you removed from the Metro Nest window. I felt my professional pride take a direct hit. Someone had penetrated the brownstone, violated Fritz's kitchen, breached Wolfe's desk, and removed evidence while we slept peacefully upstairs like trusting children. How did they get in? Quietly and professionally. Fritz, have you noticed any other disturbances? Fritz appeared from the hallway as if summoned by the gravity of the situation. The back door lock shows no damage, but there are faint scratches on the paint near the jamb, consistent with the use of professional entry tools. Also, the salt service in the dining room was repositioned by approximately 1/4 inch during the night. Wolfe's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over a picnic. The salt service positioning was one of his particular obsessions, a small ritual that helped maintain the precise order he required for proper digestion and clear thinking. Someone had violated not just his security, but his personal habits, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of his routines and preferences. "Enough," he said, reaching for the phone. "Saul Panzer will investigate the extent of this intrusion. You will change all locks immediately, and we will accelerate our investigation of the Kincaid Foundation's legal arrangements." The phone rang before I could dial Saul's number. When I answered, his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd spent a productive evening asking uncomfortable questions and receiving illuminating answers. "Your photographer friend has been busy," Saul reported without preamble. Caleb Vale is a professional alias. His real name is Marcus Webb, and he specializes in corporate surveillance and industrial espionage. Clean record, expensive equipment, and a client list that includes several prominent law firms. Any connection to our foundation friends? Direct connection. Webb's been paid through a shell company that traces back to Kincaid and Hartley. James Hartley's firm has been his primary employer for the past 6 months, with payments totaling over $40,000 for what the invoices describe as documentation services and asset verification. I made notes while Saul talked, and the picture that emerged was considerably more complex than simple board politics. 40,000 buys a lot of surveillance. It buys 3 months of comprehensive documentation. Webb's equipment rental records show he's been monitoring multiple locations, the foundation offices, several board members' residences, and your brownstone. The operation began in March, well before Miss Voss made her first appointment with Mr. Wolfe. That information rearranged my understanding of the timeline completely. So this wasn't a reaction to her hiring us. We were already targets. Precisely. Webb was hired to document the activities of everyone connected to the foundation, including potential outside consultants. Miss Voss's visit to the brownstone provided an opportunity to photograph Mr. Wolfe's office, but the surveillance was already in place. When I relayed Saul's report to Wolfe, his expression shifted from irritation to something considerably more focused and dangerous. Someone had been watching his house, documenting his routines and preparing for exactly the kind of investigation Miss Voss had eventually commissioned. The level of preparation suggested not just professional surveillance, but strategic planning that extended far beyond simple board politics. "Mr. Hartley has been thorough," Wolfe observed, leaning back in his chair with the deliberate calm that precedes decisive action. "He has documented our clients' activities, penetrated our security, and demonstrated his ability to violate our sanctuary at will. Most educational. So what's our next move? We will attend Miss Voss's board meeting this afternoon. But first, we will ensure that Mr. Hartley understands the consequences of trespassing in my house." Wolfe's smile was thin and cold. "He has chosen to make this personal. That was an error in judgment that will prove costly." The phone rang again, and this time it was Miss Voss, calling from her office with tension evident in her voice, despite her attempts at professional composure. "The board meeting has been moved up to 2 o'clock, she reported. Dr. Whitfield called an emergency session, citing urgent financial considerations that require immediate attention. He's also requested that all board members bring their personal copies of Foundation documents and correspondence. A document review suggests they're preparing for legal action, I observed. Or destroying evidence, Wolfe corrected. Miss Voss, you will attend as scheduled. You will not resign, regardless of pressure or inducements, and you will announce that you've commissioned an independent audit of all Foundation expenditures for the past year, with particular attention to legal fees and consulting expenses. That will create considerable opposition. It will create illumination. Mr. Hartley's reaction to your audit announcement will clarify his position and his involvement in the surveillance operation. Wolfe reached for his bear with the satisfaction of a man setting a trap. Mr. Goodwin will accompany you as your personal representative. His presence will ensure that all parties understand you are not operating without support. After Miss Voss left to prepare for the meeting, I found myself examining the brownstone with new eyes. Someone had walked through these rooms, touched these objects, violated the sanctuary that Wolfe guarded with monastic dedication. The paprika had been sampled, the hair trap had been discovered and removed, the salt service had been repositioned as a calling card. It was the kind of professional trespass that demonstrated not just capability, but contempt. A message that nowhere was safe. No detail too small for observation, no security measure beyond penetration. But it was also the kind of calculated insult that Nero Wolfe would neither forgive nor forget. The shot from across the street had been fired, but the real battle was just beginning. Someone had made the mistake of treating Wolfe's brownstone as their personal surveillance post and Fritz's kitchen as their private laboratory. That presumption would be corrected, and the correction would be thorough, methodical, and absolutely final. The subtle trespass had been noted, catalogued, and filed under scores to settle. This afternoon's board meeting would begin the settlement process, and James Hartley would discover that some violations carry compound interest. There are afternoons when tension builds like a thunderstorm, and there are afternoons when it builds like a chess game. Move by careful move, with each piece positioned for maximum damage. Thursday afternoon fell into the second category, which made it considerably more dangerous than a straightforward confrontation would have been. At 1:30, I escorted Miss Voss to the Kincaid Cultural Foundation offices. The building had acquired an air of nervous energy since my last visit, the kind that makes security guards check their watches and receptionists practice their most professional smiles. Miss Voss maintained her boardroom composure, but I could see the tension in the precise way she held her portfolio and the measured cadence of her steps. The elevator delivered us to the conference floor, where someone had been busy with the decorating. Outside the boardroom, on a gilt console table that hadn't been there yesterday, sat a fresh arrangement of white lilies with a pristine ribbon proclaiming, "With our appreciation." No card, no florist's signature, just the kind of anonymous gesture that makes experienced private detectives reach for their magnifying glasses. "You didn't order those," I observed, examining the arrangement with professional interest. "No," Miss Voss replied, her voice carefully neutral. "And I've never mentioned to anyone here that lilies are my favorite flower." I leaned closer to the bouquet, using the pretext of admiring the craftsmanship to examine the stems and ribbon more carefully. What I found confirmed my suspicions. A small plastic device, no larger than a shirt button, nestled among the lily stems and wired into the arrangement with professional precision. A miniature camera, positioned to capture anyone entering or leaving the boardroom. "Appreciation indeed," I murmured, taking 2 quick photographs with my phone. One of the device, one of the florist's label on the vase. "Let's appreciate from a distance." I didn't remove the camera. Wolfe had taught me that sometimes the best way to handle surveillance is to let it continue while you control what it sees. Instead, I sent a quick text to Saul Panzer with the photos and a note about the florist's name. Madrigal Floral, Long Island City. The boardroom confrontation. Inside the conference room, the Kincaid Foundation's board had assembled with the solemnity of a war council. Dr. Marcus Whitfield presided with academic authority, his expensive suit and carefully arranged papers suggesting a man who'd prepared for this moment with considerable anticipation. Dr. Sarah Chen sat with professional composure, her hands folded precisely on the mahogany table. Vincent Romano offered his practiced smile, but something behind his eyes suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. James Hartley had positioned himself like a fortress, surrounded by legal documents and wearing the expression of a man who controlled the battlefield. Only Janet Morrison, Miss Voss's sole reliable ally, offered a genuinely welcoming smile, though concern shadowed her features. Dr. Whitfield called the meeting to order with the gravity of a man announcing the end of civilization. His opening remarks were a masterpiece of academic circumlocution, filled with references to fiduciary responsibilities, institutional stability, and prudent stewardship, while carefully avoiding any direct mention of the elephant in the room, Miss Voss's impending resignation. When he ceded the floor to James Hartley, the real offensive began. Hartley outlined the anonymous donation with the smooth precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. $12 million, contingent upon renewed leadership direction and administrative restructuring. He then produced a copy of the $10,000 check Miss Voss had given Wolfe, presenting it as evidence of questionable expenditure of Foundation resources for personal consultations. While we appreciate Miss Voss's dedication, Hartley concluded, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority, the expenditure of significant Foundation funds on private investigators, particularly during delicate donor negotiations, raises serious questions about judgment and institutional priorities. Miss Voss had sat through this performance with the composure of a queen watching peasants debate her divine right. When Hartley finished, she stood with deliberate grace and delivered Wolfe's prepared counterattack. "Mr. Hartley," she began, her voice carrying across the room with crystal clarity, "my consultation with Mr. Wolfe is not a personal matter. It is directly related to the security of this institution and the integrity of its governance. Someone has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of this foundation, its board members, and its executive director. Someone has attempted to intimidate me into resigning through the use of illegally obtained photographs and carefully orchestrated pressure." A murmur rippled through the room. Whitfield looked genuinely startled, while Romano's practiced composure slipped enough to reveal surprise and calculation in equal measure. "Furthermore," Miss Voss continued, "I find it highly suspicious that an anonymous donor with the Foundation's best interests at heart would demand my immediate resignation as a condition of their generosity. Such demands, accompanied by surveillance and intimidation, suggest motives that have nothing to do with philanthropy." Then she dropped the bombshell Wolfe had prepared. "Therefore, I am formally requesting an immediate, comprehensive, independent audit of all Foundation expenditures for the past 12 months. This audit will pay particular attention to legal fees, consulting expenses, and any payments made to third-party contractors for surveillance services, documentation services, or asset verification." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Hartley's professional mask slipped for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for me to see anger, calculation, and something that might have been fear. Whitfield sputtered about baseless accusations and procedural irregularities. Romano suddenly found his manicure fascinating. Dr. Chen, ever the pragmatist, broke the silence. An audit, while disruptive, may be necessary to restore confidence. If there are questions about improper activities, the Foundation must address them transparently. Janet Morrison immediately seconded the motion, and even Romano, reading the political winds, reluctantly agreed. The audit motion passed 4-2 with only Whitfield and Hartley in opposition. Escalating surveillance. As we left the building, I noticed the black sedan parked across the street, the same one that had appeared outside the brownstone earlier in the week. The driver, a stocky man in a dark suit, looked away quickly when I met his gaze, but not before I'd memorized his face and license plate number. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe examining a small electronic device with the concentration he usually reserved for orchid catalogs. Fritz stood nearby with the expression of a man whose sanctuary had been violated in ways that transcended mere burglary. "The dining room," Fritz explained when he saw my questioning look. "Beneath the chair rail, painted to match the woodwork. A listening device, professionally installed." Wolfe held up the button-sized microphone, its beige paint designed to blend with the brownstone's interior. "Our photographer has acquired assistance," he observed. "The house has been comprehensively compromised." I reported on the board meeting, the camera in the lilies, and the continued surveillance. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, processing the information with the methodical precision of a master strategist. "Predictable," he said when I finished. "Predictably illegal," I corrected. "Predictably stupid," Wolfe replied. "Mr. Hartley has grown accustomed to having the room to himself. He's forgotten that surveillance is a game that can be played by multiple parties." My phone buzzed with a text from Saul. "Madrigal Floor, LLC, registered to D. Madrigal, cousin of A. Lomas, paralegal at Kincaid and Hartley. Purchases billed to K&H client escrow. Also, courier service makes regular runs from K&H to off-site storage facility, 11th Avenue. Your Lily camera is their operation." I showed Wolfe the message. His expression shifted from irritation to something considerably more focused and dangerous. "Excellent," he said, reaching for his beer with the satisfaction of a man whose trap had just been sprung. "Mr. Hartley has provided us with a complete organizational chart of his surveillance operation. Most thoughtful. So what's our next move? We will exploit Mr. Hartley's apparatus against him." Wolfe gestured toward the microphone Fritz had discovered. "Replace that device exactly where you found it. Tonight at 9, you will serve beer in the office, and we will discuss, loudly, our intention to seek an emergency injunction tomorrow morning to freeze all Foundation assets pending the audit results." I stared at him. "You want to feed them false information?" "I want to provide them with a program for tomorrow's performance. They've been kind enough to install the equipment. We shall be gracious enough to use it." His smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Hartley has chosen to make this personal by violating my house. That was an error in judgment that will prove educational for everyone involved." Fritz carefully reinstalled the listening device, and at 9 o'clock sharp, we performed our little drama for our invisible audience. I served beer with unusual ceremony, while Wolfe expounded loudly on legal strategies, injunctions, and asset freezes. If Hartley was listening, and we were certain he was, he would spend the night preparing for a legal battle that would never come. As I settled into bed that night, I reflected on how thoroughly the game had changed. The shot from across the street had evolved into a comprehensive surveillance operation, complete with professional equipment, legal cover, and systematic intimidation. But Wolfe had turned their own apparatus against them, and tomorrow we would discover just how far James Hartley was willing to go to protect whatever scheme lay behind the anonymous donation. The brownstone had been trespassed, its master provoked, and its quiet rhythms disrupted. But now, with the battle lines clearly drawn and the enemy's methods exposed, the real work could begin. Hartley had fired his shot from across the street. Tomorrow we would return fire with interest compounded. The pressure had increased, but so had our understanding of who was applying it and why. In Nero Wolfe's world, that understanding was the first step toward victory. There are mornings when a man wakes up knowing he's been outmaneuvered, and there are mornings when he wakes up knowing he's about to return the favor with interest compounded. Friday morning fell decisively into the second category, which made Fritz's coffee taste like victory, and the morning newspaper read like a program for the day's entertainment. I came down to find Wolfe already installed behind his desk at the unprecedented hour of 8:45, a deviation from his sacred orchid schedule that signaled either emergency or the kind of tactical satisfaction that makes early rising worthwhile. The listening device Fritz had reinstalled was performing admirably. If James Hartley had spent the night preparing for a legal siege that would never materialize. He'd done so with our full knowledge and considerable amusement. "Saul has been productive," Wolfe announced, without looking up from a manila folder thick with surveillance photographs. "Our Mr. Hartley's operation extends considerably beyond Miss Voss and the Foundation Board. He has been documenting the activities of individuals connected to 6 different cultural institutions throughout the city." I poured coffee and settled into my chair, ready for the morning intelligence briefing. The folder contained enough photographs to stock a blackmailer's retirement fund, board members, executives, major donors, and their various associates, all captured in the kind of candid moments that make privacy lawyers nervous and divorce attorneys optimistic. "Industrial espionage with cultural camouflage," I observed, studying a particularly unflattering shot of a museum director accepting an envelope from someone who looked like he charged by the felony. "Corporate acquisition through systematic intimidation," Wolfe corrected. "Someone with substantial resources has been positioning themselves to influence or control multiple cultural institutions simultaneously. The Kincaid Foundation was merely the test case." The phone rang at 9:15. Saul Panzer's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd spent a profitable night asking uncomfortable questions and receiving illuminating answers. "Early movement at the storage facility," he reported. "Hartley's paralegal, Lomas, arrived at 6 with 2 bankers' boxes and a shredder. Spent 3 hours destroying documents. But he also deposited something. Old ledger books, green binding, handled like they contained the crown jewels." "Historical records?" I asked. "Or historical forgeries," Wolfe replied after I'd relayed Saul's report. "Mr. Hartley is either preserving evidence or manufacturing it. Either way, his activities confirm our assessment of his desperation." The strategic deployment. What followed was a masterpiece of sedentary warfare. Wolfe, without rising from his chair or raising his voice above conversational level, began dismantling James Hartley's carefully constructed operation with the methodical precision of a demolition expert who'd studied the building's blueprints for weeks. First, he dictated 3 formal communications, which I typed on his heavy vellum stationery that makes ordinary paper feel like tissue and carries the implicit threat of serious consequences for anyone who ignores its contents. The first was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton. "Madame, you have been under unauthorized surveillance for 3 weeks. The attached photograph was taken Tuesday at 4:15 p.m. as you entered your residence. I suggest you examine carefully who has been voting your foundation shares and for what purposes. Your presence is required at my office this evening at 8 o'clock. N.W." The second went to Dr. Marcus Whitfield. "Sir, your use of photographic equipment at the Foundation offices Monday last, in company with a professional surveillance operative, requires explanation. If you decline to provide one, I shall draw my own conclusions and present them to your board. 8 o'clock this evening. N.W." The third was reserved for Vincent Romano. "Sir, your gallery's reputation depends upon unimpeachable provenance and ethical dealing. I have information that may compromise both. Your attendance at my office tonight will be to your advantage. 8 o'clock. N.W." "Direct and unequivocal," I observed, sealing the envelopes. "Necessarily so. Subtlety is wasted on people who hire photographers to violate other people's privacy." Wolfe reached for his beer with the satisfaction of a general who just positioned his artillery. "Now we shall observe their reactions." The Pemberton Gambit. At 10:30, I personally delivered Mrs. Pemberton's summons to her Sutton Place apartment, a shrine to wealth and taste that made the Metropolitan Museum look understated. The lady herself received me in her drawing room, surrounded by enough Renaissance art to fund a small war and with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When I handed her the photograph of herself entering her building, taken with professional equipment from across the street, her composure never wavered, but something behind her sharp eyes shifted from polite attention to focused calculation. Dr. Whitfield assured me that Miss Voss's removal was necessary. for the Foundation's stability, she said, studying the surveillance photograph with the concentration of someone who'd learned early that information was power. He made no mention of photography or observation. He may not have known, I suggested. The surveillance was coordinated through the Foundation's legal counsel. Mr. Hartley has been quite thorough in documenting the activities of all board members. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the photograph. All board members. 17 different individuals connected to 6 cultural institutions. You're part of a comprehensive intelligence operation, Mrs. Pemberton. The question is whether you're a target or a participant. When I left her apartment 20 minutes later, Mrs. Pemberton had agreed to attend Wolfe's evening gathering and had expressed considerable interest in reviewing all legal expenditures authorized in her name during the past year. The pressure campaign. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe orchestrating a campaign of systematic pressure that would have impressed a medieval siege master. Miss Voss had been instructed to send a formal legal demand to Kincaid and sought Hartley for complete documentation of the anonymous donation, including donor identity and all related communications. The request was designed not to succeed, but to force Hartley into defensive positions that would reveal the extent of his involvement. At noon, Dr. Sarah Chen called, her usual professional composure frayed around the edges. Mr. Goodwin, this situation is becoming intolerable. Dr. Whitfield is panicking. Romano is threatening to resign from the board. And now Mrs. Pemberton is demanding an emergency audit of all legal expenses. Sounds like the Foundation is experiencing some administrative turbulence, I observed with carefully neutral sympathy. This is more than turbulence. It's chaos. And it's all stemming from Miss Voss's refusal to accept a generous resignation package. Her voice carried the frustration of someone watching a carefully planned operation collapse. What exactly does Mr. Wolfe want? Mr. Wolfe wants the truth about who's been photographing his office and why. Everything else is just consequences. She hung up without promising anything, but the call confirmed that Wolfe's pressure tactics were having their intended effect. The coalition supporting Miss Voss's removal was fracturing under the weight of revelations about surveillance and unauthorized legal expenditures. Hartley's defensive maneuvers. At 2 o'clock, James Hartley's response to Miss Voss's document request arrived by messenger. A terse refusal citing client confidentiality and proprietary information. But the tone was defensive rather than authoritative. The legal language carried the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. More telling was Saul's report from his continued surveillance of the storage facility. 3 more document destruction sessions since morning. Lomas looks like he hasn't slept, and Hartley himself showed up at 1:30 with a briefcase and a portable shredder. Whatever they're destroying, they're in a hurry to get rid of it. Excellent, Wolfe observed, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose trap was performing exactly as designed. Mr. Hartley is now destroying evidence faster than he can manufacture explanations. His desperation will make this evening's confrontation considerably more productive. At 4 o'clock, Vincent Romano called personally, his practiced charm replaced by barely controlled anxiety. Mr. Goodwin, I don't know what game you're playing, but it's affecting my business. I've had 3 major clients cancel appointments today, citing concerns about my association with institutional irregularities. Perhaps you should reconsider your association with institutional irregularities, I suggested. What do you want? The truth about your involvement in Miss Voss's forced resignation and your cooperation in identifying who's been orchestrating the surveillance operation. I'll be there tonight, he said, and hung up with the resignation of a man who'd realized his options had been systematically eliminated. The final positioning. By 6 o'clock, Wolfe had assembled all the pieces for his evening confrontation. The board members were fractured and suspicious. Hartley was desperate and defensive, and the surveillance operation that had begun as a weapon against Miss Voss had been turned into evidence against its orchestrators. Fritz had prepared dinner with the solemnity appropriate for the evening's significance. Boeuf à la bourguignonne that would provide proper sustenance for the intellectual combat ahead. The office had been arranged with Wolfe's preferred precision. Chairs positioned for maximum psychological impact, lighting adjusted to favor the host, and the atmosphere carefully calibrated to encourage confession rather than defiance. "They will all attend," Wolfe announced, settling behind his desk with the finality of a judge taking the bench. Mrs. Pemberton, because she's been violated and wants answers. Dr. Whitfield, because he's been compromised and needs protection. Dr. Chen, because she's been outmaneuvered and requires clarification. Romano, because his reputation depends on distancing himself from scandal. And Hartley, because his legal career depends on containing the damage. And Webb. Mr. Webb will accompany Mr. Hartley, because a man who's been destroying evidence all day will want his photographer present to document whatever final performance he's planning. Wolfe's smile was thin and cold. They think they're attending a negotiation. They're actually attending a reckoning. The shot from across the street had been fired, but Wolfe had positioned himself to return fire with devastating accuracy. The brownstone's sanctity had been violated, its master provoked, and its quiet rhythms disrupted. But now, with the enemy's weapons turned against them and their strategy exposed, the real work of justice could begin. At 8 o'clock, they would all gather in Wolfe's office, the scholar with ambition, the curator with designs, the dealer with appetites, the dowager with power, and the lawyer with his photographer's bag of evidence. Wolfe had positioned every piece with the precision of a chess master, and now it was time to announce checkmate. The positioning was complete. The gathering could begin. There are evenings when Nero Wolfe's office becomes a theater, and there are evenings when it becomes a courtroom where justice wears evening clothes and speaks in measured syllables. Friday at 8 o'clock. It became both simultaneously, which made for the kind of performance that leaves audiences either enlightened or indicted, depending on their seat in the drama. Fritz had prepared the stage with his usual precision. The red leather chairs were arranged in a calculated semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, each positioned to maximize psychological discomfort while maintaining the illusion of civilized discourse. The lighting cast. Dramatic shadows that would make even innocent expressions appear conspiratorial, and the atmosphere carried the weight of approaching judgment. Beer sat at Wolfe's right hand like a golden gavel, and I had positioned myself where I could observe every face, every gesture, every tell that might illuminate the evening's revelations. The assembly. They arrived in order of increasing desperation, which provided its own form of entertainment. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton entered first, punctual to the minute, and radiating the kind of authority that comes with 8 decades of getting her own way. She wore pearls that could have ransomed a small nation, and the expression of someone who'd spent her afternoon making uncomfortable phone calls to uncomfortable people. Dr. Marcus Whitfield followed, looking like a man who'd spent his day watching his carefully constructed academic empire crumble into footnotes. His usual professorial confidence had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone who'd realized that intelligence and cunning are not synonymous. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived with her professional composure intact, but strained around the edges, like expensive fabric under pressure. She nodded politely, but kept her attention focused on Wolfe with the wariness of someone who'd recognized a superior strategist. Vincent Romano entered with his practiced charm firmly in place, but something behind his eyes suggested he'd spent the afternoon calculating the cost of his association with the evening's other participants. At 8:15, James Hartley made his entrance with the deliberate confidence of a man who decided that attack was preferable to defense. He was accompanied by Marcus Webb, the stocky photographer whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the careful alertness of someone accustomed to documenting other people's mistakes. Finally, Miss Voss arrived with Janet Morrison, both women carrying themselves with the dignity of people who discovered their enemies and chosen to face them directly. The systematic destruction. Wolfe surveyed his assembled audience with the satisfaction of a conductor preparing to lead a particularly complex symphony. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a closing argument delivered by someone who'd already won the case. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his hands flat on the desk blotter, "someone has presumed to violate the sanctity of my home, to observe my activities, and to trespass upon my privacy. This evening we shall discuss the consequences of that presumption." He gestured toward a neat stack of manila folders arranged on his desk with theatrical precision. "Mr. Goodwin has prepared a comprehensive exhibition of evidence. Archie, if you would." I stood and began the presentation that would systematically dismantle the conspiracy that had brought them all together. Exhibit A, photographs taken from the Metro Nest building, second floor, third window from the east, showing this office and its occupants. Exhibit B, invoices from Madrigal Floral LLC to Kincaid and Hartley for surveillance equipment disguised as flower arrangements. Exhibit C, payment records showing $40,000 transferred from K&H client escrow to Marcus Webb for documentation services. Exhibit D, a microphone painted to match our dining room woodwork discovered this morning. With each exhibit, I watched the faces around the semicircle. Whitfield grew progressively paler. Romano's practiced charm cracked like old paint, and Chen's professional composure began showing stress fractures. "Dr. Whitfield," Wolfe said, his attention focusing like a laser on the academic, "you provided Mr. Webb with access to the foundation offices, architectural plans, and confidential board correspondence. You also arranged for him to photograph the building's interior under the pretext of academic research. Your cooperation was purchased with the promise of Miss Voss's position, was it not?" Whitfield's professorial authority crumbled completely. The foundation needed leadership with genuine cultural vision, not merely administrative efficiency. The board required complete documentation to make informed decisions. "The board," Wolfe interrupted, "was never intended to make that decision. The decision had been made by someone with considerably more resources than academic salaries provide and considerably more ambition than scholarly advancement requires." He turned to Romano, whose practiced smile had been gradually replaced by the wariness of a trapped animal. "Mr. Romano, your gallery faces bankruptcy. Your opposition to the Marchetti bronzes was not aesthetic, it was financial necessity. Miss Voss's removal would facilitate the sale of your client list and exhibition rights to a larger concern. The Meridian Cultural Group, I believe." Romano's professional mask slipped entirely. "You can't prove. I can prove that your insurance policies were canceled for non-payment, that your lease is in arrears, and that you've been meeting regularly with Meridian representatives who specialize in acquiring distressed cultural institutions." Wolfe gestured toward another folder. "Saul Panzer has been thorough. The central revelation, Dr. Chen, recognizing the systematic nature of Wolfe's attack, attempted damage control. Mr. Wolfe, if there have been irregularities, I had no knowledge of surveillance activities." "Dr. Chen," Wolfe said with the patience of a teacher correcting a persistent error, "your knowledge is irrelevant. Your participation is not. You provided detailed information about Miss Voss's personal habits and security arrangements. That intelligence enabled the compilation of the intimidation dossier." Finally, he turned his full attention to James Hartley, who had watched his co-conspirator's destruction with the professional detachment of a lawyer calculating billable hours for a lost cause. "Mr. Hartley, you have orchestrated this entire operation with methodical precision. The surveillance, the intimidation, the systematic pressure on board members, all conducted under the protection of attorney-client privilege and financed through legal expense accounts. But you are not the architect of this conspiracy. You are merely its local contractor." Hartley's professional composure remained intact, but something behind his eyes shifted toward desperation. "You're making serious accusations without substantive proof. Attorney-client privilege protects..." Attorney-client privilege does not protect criminal conspiracy, extortion, or systematic evidence destruction, Wolfe interrupted. Nor does it protect you from the consequences of underestimating your opposition. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to conversational level while somehow becoming more menacing. Your client, Mr. Hartley, is the Meridian Cultural Group, a consortium that specializes in acquiring control of cultural institutions through systematic intimidation and financial pressure. They have been targeting 6 foundations simultaneously, using the same methods: surveillance, board infiltration, and manufactured crises designed to force leadership changes. Webb, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "I have recordings," he said quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of a man abandoning a sinking ship. "All our meetings, all the instructions, all the payments. I document everything for protection." The silence that followed was profound enough to have physical weight. Hartley's professional mask finally cracked, revealing the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed operation had been turned inside out and used against him. The resolution, Mrs. Pemberton broke the silence with the authority of someone who'd spent 8 decades making decisions that mattered. "Mr. Hartley, you're terminated immediately. The Foundation will seek new legal counsel, and I'll be recommending criminal prosecution for your surveillance activities." She turned to address the other board members with imperial finality. "Dr. Whitfield, your resignation from the board is expected by Monday morning. Mr. Romano, your association with this foundation ends tonight. Dr. Chen, you may remain if you can demonstrate that your future loyalty lies with the institution rather than with outside interests." Looking directly at Miss Voss, she continued, "Miss Voss has my complete support and all 3 of my votes. The Marchetti acquisition will proceed as planned, and any future anonymous donations will be subjected to the most rigorous scrutiny." Dr. Whitfield slumped in his chair like a man watching his career evaporate. Romano stood and headed for the door without a word, his practiced charm finally exhausted. Dr. Chen gathered her things with professional efficiency, already calculating her survival strategy. As the office emptied, Webb approached Wolfe's desk with the resignation of a man who'd chosen his side. "Mr. Wolfe, I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. The recordings include specific instructions about targeting cultural institutions throughout the city." Hartley, abandoned by his co-conspirators and facing the ruins of his legal career, made one final attempt at damage control. "This is all circumstantial. You have no direct evidence of criminal activity." Wolfe's smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Hartley, I have Webb's recordings, Saul's surveillance documentation, and the physical evidence of your trespass in my home. More importantly, I have your systematic destruction of evidence, which suggests consciousness of guilt more clearly than any confession could." The philosophical conclusion. After the last of them had departed, leaving only Wolfe, Miss Voss, and myself in the office's restored quiet, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd completed a particularly challenging puzzle. "Miss Voss," he said, reaching for his beer, "your position is secure, your acquisition will proceed, and your board has been clarified. The Foundation will survive this assault on its integrity." "And the Meridian Cultural Group?" she asked. "Will discover that their systematic approach to cultural acquisition has been systematically documented and will be systematically prosecuted." He took a sip of beer and regarded her with half-closed eyes. "They chose to make this personal by violating my sanctuary. That was an error in judgment that will prove educational for everyone involved." As Miss Voss gathered her things and prepared to leave, Wolfe offered his final observation on the evening's events. The shot from across the street, Miss Voss, was fired by people who believed that culture could be acquired like any other commodity, through intimidation, surveillance, and financial pressure. They failed to understand that true cultural institutions are defended not by their endowments, but by the people who understand their value. He gestured toward the restored quiet of his office. Some sanctuaries once violated defend themselves. After she left, I found myself examining the office that had been photographed, bugged, and trespassed upon, but had ultimately served as the stage for justice rather than surrender. The brownstone's quiet rhythms had been restored, its master's privacy vindicated, and the shot from across the street had been answered with devastating accuracy. Fritz appeared with the evening's final service, a perfectly arranged tray with Wolfe's nightcap and the satisfied expression of a man whose kitchen had been avenged. "The paprika," he announced with quiet triumph, "has been replaced with a superior Hungarian variety. The violation has been corrected and improved upon." Wolfe raised his glass in a small salute to Fritz's resilience and the brownstone's restored sanctity. "Excellent, Fritz. Some trespasses, when properly addressed, result in permanent improvements." As I settled down to type up the evening's events, I reflected on how thoroughly the game had changed from that first photograph delivered to Miss Voss's office. What had begun as simple board politics had revealed itself as part of a comprehensive assault on cultural institutions throughout the city. But Nero Wolfe had turned their own weapons against them, and the brownstone had proven once again that some sanctuaries are more dangerous to violate than to respect. The shot from across the street had been fired, returned, and settled with the kind of finality that makes future shots inadvisable. The Kincaid Cultural Foundation would survive. The Marchetti bronzes would find their proper home, and somewhere in the city, the Meridian Cultural Group was discovering that some targets shoot back with interest compounded. Justice had been served. Dinner would be excellent tomorrow, and the brownstone's peace had been restored through the simple expedient of making violation more costly than respect. In Nero Wolfe's world, that was the most satisfying resolution of all. There are mornings when a man wakes up knowing his enemies have been routed, and there are mornings when he wakes up knowing the routing was so thorough it'll be talked about in professional circles for years. Saturday morning fell decisively into the second category, which made Fritz's coffee taste like victory, and the morning newspaper read like a program for yesterday's entertainment. I came down to find Wolfe already installed behind his desk at the unprecedented hour of 9:15. Surrounded by manila folders and wearing the expression of a man who'd spent a satisfying evening watching elaborate schemes collapse under the weight of their own presumption. The listening device had been removed from the dining room. The paprika had been replaced with a superior Hungarian variety, and the brownstone's natural rhythms had been restored through the simple expedient of making violation more costly than respect. The official aftermath. At 10:30, Inspector Kramer arrived with Sergeant Stebbins and the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from having a complex case delivered with comprehensive documentation and cooperative witnesses. Kramer planted himself in front of Wolfe's desk, set his cigar where it could ruin the air most efficiently, and got down to business. "All right," he growled, opening a folder thick enough to prosecute half of Manhattan. "You've got a photographer ready to sing, a lawyer who shredded paper until the machine begged for mercy, and enough recorded conversations to keep prosecutors busy through Christmas. Now tell me exactly what we're dealing with." Marcus Webb sat in the red leather chair, looking like a man who decided that cooperation was preferable to incarceration. His expensive equipment lay catalogued on my desk. Telephoto lenses, recording devices, miniature cameras, and enough surveillance gear to stalk a spy novel. More importantly, he'd brought 2 years' worth of meticulous records documenting not just the Kincaid operation, but similar campaigns against cultural institutions throughout the city. "The Meridian Cultural Group," Wolfe began, his hands flat on the desk blotter, "is a corporate entity that specializes in the systematic acquisition and consolidation of cultural assets. They do not purchase institutions directly. They destabilize them through surveillance, intimidation, and manufactured crises, then offer themselves as saviors with rescue donations and management contracts." He gestured toward Webb's documentation with the precision of a professor presenting evidence. Mr. Webb's recordings reveal a methodology that is both comprehensive and ruthless. First, they conduct extensive surveillance to identify institutional vulnerabilities and map internal politics. Then they introduce a catalyst, in this case, the anonymous donation conditional upon Miss Voss's removal, forcing the board to choose between financial security and existing leadership. The systematic revelation. While that crisis unfolds, I continued, consulting my notes, they manipulate individual board members through their specific vulnerabilities. Whitfield was promised academic advancement, Romano was pressured through financial difficulties, Chen was offered a platform for her modernization agenda. Wolfe nodded approvingly. Mr. Hartley, as legal counsel, was perfectly positioned to orchestrate this from within. Attorney-client privilege provided cover for the surveillance operation, the intimidation campaign, and even the violation of my sanctuary, which they mistook for merely another target in their corporate acquisition game. Kramer studied the organizational charts Webb had provided, his expression growing darker with each page. 6 institutions targeted simultaneously. The Kincaid Foundation was just their test case. Precisely, Wolfe confirmed. Had Miss Voss resigned, Meridian would have gained board representation through their proxies. The Marchetti acquisition would have been blocked, the Foundation's resources redirected toward digital initiatives that would centralize control, and within 2 years, the Kincaid would have been absorbed into Meridian's corporate empire. Webb finally spoke, his voice carrying the resignation of a man who documented his own employer's crimes. They have a 5-year plan to control the cultural narrative of Manhattan through systematic institutional acquisition. Museums, foundations, galleries, all converted into content distribution networks with centralized management and profit maximization protocols. The corporate mastermind. The architect of this conspiracy, Wolfe continued, opening another folder, is Helena Meridian, a technology entrepreneur who believes that cultural institutions are inefficient distribution systems for intellectual property. She views Renaissance bronzes as content, assets and exhibition programs as product launches. He read from one of Webb's transcripts. Mrs. Meridian has spoken of optimizing cultural delivery systems, monetizing curatorial expertise, and eliminating redundant administrative structures. She treats culture not as a living system to be nurtured, but as a commodity market to be dominated. Kramer stubbed out his cigar with the satisfaction of a man who'd identified his primary target. Corporate raiding with intellectual pretensions. We'll have federal warrants for Meridian, Hartley, and 3 Meridian executives by this afternoon. The conspiracy charges will include wire fraud, racketeering, and enough privacy violations to discourage future cultural raiders. The consequences. By noon, the systematic destruction of the Meridian conspiracy was well underway. Dr. Whitfield had been terminated from Columbia and faced professional sanctions that would end his academic career. Vincent Romano's gallery would be liquidated to pay creditors, his cooperation with investigators being the only thing preventing criminal charges. Dr. Chen had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity and had already provided detailed information about Meridian's approach to other institutions. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton had used her considerable influence to ensure that the Kincaid Foundation's legal affairs would be handled by a firm with impeccable reputation and no connection to cultural acquisition schemes. The Marchetti bronzes would be acquired as planned, and Miss Voss's position was more secure than before the conspiracy began. The final consultation. That afternoon, Miss Voss arrived for what we all understood would be our final consultation. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd survived a systematic assault on her professional integrity and emerged stronger for the experience. The foundation has been preserved, Wolfe told her. Not merely from hostile acquisition, but from a fundamental transformation that would have destroyed its essential nature. Mrs. Meridian failed to understand that cultural institutions, unlike technology companies, cannot be optimized without destroying the very qualities that make them valuable. "And the other institutions Meridian targeted," she asked, "will benefit from our exposure of their methodology. Federal investigators are already contacting boards and administrators who've experienced similar anonymous donations and sudden leadership crises." Wolfe's smile was thin and satisfied. "Mrs. Meridian's systematic approach has become systematically documented evidence for multiple prosecutions." Miss Voss stood to leave, but paused with a final question. "Mr. Wolfe, why did they target the Kincaid specifically? We're not the largest or most prestigious institution in the city." "Because, Miss Voss, you were the most competent administrator they encountered. Their methodology required institutional weakness to succeed. Your strength made you a threat to be eliminated rather than an asset to be acquired." He reached for his beer with deliberate satisfaction. "They presume to treat you as a problem to be solved rather than a guardian to be respected. That presumption has been corrected." The philosophical resolution. After Miss Voss departed, Wolfe settled behind his desk with a kind of profound satisfaction that comes from defending principles that transcend individual cases or specific clients. Fritz appeared with dinner service, his kitchen having returned to its normal rhythms now that the trespassers had been identified, prosecuted, and removed from consideration. "The house," Fritz announced with quiet triumph, "has been purified of intrusion and improved by experience." Wolfe raised his beer in acknowledgement of Fritz's resilience and the brownstone's restored sanctity. "There is a conceit abroad, Fritz, that culture is merely another industry. Inputs, outputs, and profit margins. But culture that nourishes cannot be improved by intimidation, and institutions devoted to the best of human achievement must not be managed by the worst of human impulses." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze encompassing the office that had been photographed, bugged, and trespassed upon, but had ultimately served as the stage for justice rather than surrender. Mrs. Meridian discovered that some domains are not subject to acquisition, some sanctuaries defend themselves when violated, and some guardians return fire with devastating accuracy when their charges are threatened. The restored sanctuary. As evening settled over 35th Street, I reflected on how thoroughly the game had evolved from that first photograph delivered to Miss Voss's office. What had begun as a simple request to use Wolfe's window had revealed a conspiracy that threatened the cultural independence of an entire city. The shot from across the street had been fired by people who believed that culture could be acquired like any other commodity, but they'd failed to understand that true cultural institutions are defended not by their endowments, but by the people who understand their value. The brownstone felt like itself again, not just a fortress that had repelled invaders, but a sanctuary that had proven the cost of violation was higher than the price of respect. Fritz's kitchen had been restored to its proper order. Wolfe's office had returned to its natural quiet, and somewhere across the street, the third window from the east on the second floor was dark and empty, no longer trained on our activities. "The Paprika," I observed, "has been promoted to a place of honor." "As it should be," Wolfe replied. "Some violations, when properly addressed, result in permanent improvements to the defenses." The Kincaid Cultural Foundation would survive and prosper, the Marchetti bronzes would find their proper home, and throughout the city, cultural institutions would be more vigilant against systematic acquisition schemes. The conspiracy had been exposed, its perpetrators prosecuted, and the principle established that some sanctuaries are more dangerous to violate than to respect. Justice had been served with precision and finality. The brownstone's peace had been restored, and the shot from across the street had been answered with the kind of devastating accuracy that discourages future marksmen. In Nero Wolfe's world, that was the most satisfying resolution of all. Not just the solution of a case, but the defense of principles that make civilization possible. The reveal was complete, the sanctuary vindicated, and dinner would be excellent. There are Sunday mornings when a man wakes up knowing the world has been set right, and there are Sunday evenings when he realizes it's been set right so thoroughly that the correction will echo through professional circles for years to come. This particular Sunday fell decisively into the second category, which made Fritz's dinner taste like vindication and the evening's quiet feel like a restored cathedral after the vandals had been expelled and prosecuted. I came down at 6:30 to find the brownstone breathing normally again. Not the shallow respiration of a house under siege, but the deep, steady rhythm of a sanctuary that had defended itself and emerged stronger for the experience. The front doorbell minded its manners. The phone rang only when invited, and across 35th Street, the third window from the east showed a neat office space available sign that I found both informative and poetic. The official epilogue. The morning had brought a cascade of official confirmations that read like victory bulletins from a war the enemy hadn't realized they were losing until the handcuffs clicked. Helena Meridian had been arrested at Teterboro Airport, attempting to board a private flight to Switzerland, her laptop containing comprehensive documentation of cultural acquisition targets throughout North America and Europe. James Hartley faced disbarment and federal charges that would ensure his surveillance career ended in federal prison. Dr. Whitfield had been terminated from Columbia with the kind of professional sanctions that make academic exile permanent. Inspector Kramer had stopped by at noon with the satisfaction of a man who'd been handed a complex conspiracy with comprehensive documentation and cooperative witnesses. Meridian Cultural Group had offices in 6 cities and acquisition targets in 12, he'd reported, settling his bulk in front of Wolfe's desk. Their methodology was identical everywhere: surveillance, infiltration, manufactured crises, and rescue acquisitions. But they'd never encountered organized resistance before. Marcus Webb, who'd spent the weekend providing federal investigators with 2 years' worth of recorded conversations, had offered his professional assessment. Mrs. Meridian believed that cultural institutions were inherently vulnerable because they depended on wealthy donors and volunteer boards. She didn't anticipate that some guardians would fight back with systematic precision. The cultural vindication. Miss Voss had arrived in the afternoon with Janet Morrison and Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, all 3 women carrying themselves with the dignity of people who'd survived a systematic assault and emerged stronger for the experience. The Marchetti acquisition had been approved unanimously. The board had established a security fund to protect against future acquisition attempts, and most importantly, they'd created an information-sharing network among cultural institutions throughout the city. Any future attempts at systematic infiltration will be identified and countered before they can establish operational effectiveness, Mrs. Pemberton had declared with imperial finality. The Metropolitan Opera, the Frick Collection, and the Museum of the City of New York had each discovered similar surveillance operations, all now understood as part of Meridian's comprehensive campaign. The restored sanctuary. By evening, the systematic destruction of the conspiracy was complete, and the brownstone had returned to its natural rhythms. Fritz appeared in the office doorway at 7:15 with the expression of a man whose professional domain had been not merely restored, but elevated to legendary status. "Dinner is served," he announced with quiet triumph. Coq au vin, prepared with the precision that comes from uncompromised ingredients and unviolated preparation space, the Hungarian paprika has been positioned according to optimal accessibility and protection protocols. The dining room had been transformed into a celebration of restored order. The aroma of perfectly prepared chicken, rich with wine and herbs, filled the air. The table was set with the finest linen, the silver gleamed under soft light, and the wine, a carefully selected Bordeaux, breathed in its decanter like a promise of civilized evening ahead. Wolfe settled into his chair with the measured pace of a man who understood the gravity of his next engagement. He surveyed the table, his eyes lingering on the coq au vin with profound satisfaction. "Fritz," he rumbled, his voice a low purr of contentment. "You have restored order to a disordered world." As we ate, conversation was minimal, as is customary during dinner. Wolfe devoted his full concentration to the complex symphony of flavors, while I reflected on how thoroughly the case had evolved from Miss Voss's simple request to use his window. What had begun as foundation politics had revealed itself as part of a national conspiracy to consolidate cultural authority through systematic intimidation. The philosophical resolution. When the last of the chicken had been savored and the cheese course presented, Wolfe leaned back with a sigh that was more a declaration of peace than exhaustion. He took a sip of wine, the ruby liquid gleaming in the crystal. "Archie," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a final pronouncement. "The incident of the shot from across the street provides a useful illustration of a persistent human folly. There are those who believe that by observing, by cataloging, by reducing the world to data points and strategic objectives, they can control it. They mistake surveillance for understanding, documentation for wisdom." He paused, allowing the thought to settle like sediment in fine wine. Mrs. Meridian, for all her technological sophistication, failed to understand that culture, like a rare orchid, cannot be optimized through intimidation. It must be cultivated with patience, respect, and genuine appreciation for its inherent vitality. To attempt to force it into predetermined patterns is to kill it, and to attempt to control those who cultivate it through surveillance is merely to provoke a more vigorous defense. "The irony," he continued, his eyes half closed in contemplation, "is that her systematic approach, her obsession with documentation, ultimately provided the very evidence that led to her downfall. The tools of her ambition became the instruments of her undoing." I nodded, savoring both the wine and the layers of irony Wolfe had so neatly exposed. "So the brownstone remains unoptimized." Wolfe's lips curved in what, for him, constituted a smile. "Indeed. Some things, by their very nature, resist optimization. Culture that nourishes cannot be improved by intimidation, and institutions devoted to the best of human achievement must not be managed by the worst of human impulses. It is precisely in that resistance that their true value lies." The final quiet. As Wolfe rose to return to the office for his evening's reading, I remained at the table for a moment longer, savoring the restored tranquility. The brownstone had absorbed the shock of violation, processed the intrusion, and now exhaled, returning to its natural state of dignified repose. The quiet that settled over the house was not merely the absence of surveillance equipment and unwanted visitors. It was a palpable presence, rich and deep, like the silence of a cathedral after evening prayers. The phone stayed behaved, the doorbell slept, and the Metro Nest window across the street remained dark and uninteresting. Later, as I prepared the final report, I reflected on how completely the shot from across the street had been answered. The conspiracy had been systematic and professional, but it had encountered something more systematic and considerably more professional. Nero Wolfe defending principles that made civilization possible. The Kincaid Cultural Foundation would prosper, the Marchetti bronzes would find their proper home, and throughout the city, cultural guardians would sleep more soundly knowing that systematic threats could be systematically defeated. Fritz's paprika had been elevated to a place of honor. Wolfe's sanctuary had been vindicated, and somewhere in federal custody, Helena Meridian was discovering that some targets return fire with devastating accuracy. "Well," I said to the restored office as I clicked off my desk lamp, "if anybody across the street wants a curtain call, they'll have to buy a ticket." From the kitchen came the sound of Fritz humming as he completed his evening preparations, and from Wolfe's chair came the soft rustle of pages turning. The brownstone had returned to its preferred respiration, deep, steady, and unobserved. Justice had been served with precision and finality. The sanctuary had been defended and fortified, and dinner had been memorable. In Nero Wolfe's world, That was the most satisfying resolution of all, not just the solution of a case, but the defense of principles that transcend individual victories and establish precedents for civilization itself. The shot from across the street had been answered with compound interest, and the account was permanently closed.